International reputation for her research on teacher education and social work have been public policy, and particularly as it affects elementary education, but also its relationship to gender. I am intrigued by her concept of education as deliberative democracy. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that and thinking about the curriculum as social dialogue. It strikes me these are timely and productive concepts. I know they've emerged out of Poonam's own working context. She is a professor of education at the Central Institute of Education in New Delhi, so her work is very much based in and rooted in India. But the concepts that she brings with us are going to travel. We're going to think about them in dialogue with our own settings, and I'm really looking forward to what she has to say. So, Poonam, the stage is yours. We're not intending to fill the whole hour with talking at. Poonam has liberties to run as long or as short as she likes. And when she's finished and got to an appropriate moment, there will be time for questions. Poonam, over to you.
I'm having difficulty opening this. Let me first thank the organizers, especially Gemma Moss, and I know Mark Priestley had spoken about, in fact he'd heard me at the Budapest conference Visa last year, and I'm very thankful to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share some of my work, my experiences, all that I've been able to gather over the years as I have worked in the area of teacher education, but also very closely looking at school education, school curriculum, pedagogic processes. For me, teacher education is not something that can be looked at in isolation of processes that happen right inside the school in terms of the social, political, and the economic context that sort of enter into classrooms. I will just for a bit begin with the time when India as an independent country was really striving to become a republic, and we were rooted in a frame, our constitutional frame of political democracy, which was referred to by Ambedkar as one vote, one value. But there was a word of caution that Ambedkar exercised, being a Dalit himself, someone who belonged to the very lower caste of the hierarchies that we have in our society, that the absence of social democracy, he cautioned, will always keep our political democracy in danger. And I think that's where I would like to begin today's session, just to give you that background, because we are continually facing this challenge. And it's only become more difficult in the current context of the neoliberal times. So there is, in the current context, and I'm jumping 70 years to tell you now that we are at a time when we're already in the third decade of reforms and there's deep penetration of the market. Alongside, there is an assertion of homogenizing identities within India and a plural India. We've never known any other India, but there is an attempt to homogenize, which is based on a very false understanding of a majoritarian democracy. So a glossing of social differences and certainly an intensification of patriarchal frames that operate in our society. So we can see how cultural nationalism, so to speak, or the revival of cultural revivalism really is aligned to the whole neoliberal thrust on learning outcomes as the specific aims of education and teacher performance. School and teacher education curriculum in our context has, over the last decade, actually been quite exciting and something else altogether. I mean, it's very interesting that this paradox exists and so many people want to find out how is it possible that within a neoliberal frame we've been able to actually put together a cutting-edge curriculum framework that really is able to translate a lot of ideas of what I call deliberative democracy, ideas of how we can actually look at our diversity in more positive ways and enable society, the society of India, to really to become an exemplar to the world in terms of social cohesion and living together. The curriculum discourse really is something that speaks to both the school curriculum and the teacher ed curriculum. So we have the national curriculum framework that was designed in 2005 and the teacher education curriculum of 2009. And this is really the first time that both these curricular frameworks actually spoke to each other. And there was perfect harmony in terms of at least the aims and the processes that we were looking at. So questions of knowledge, questions of looking at learning, looking at the social context, looking at the epistemic identities of children. And here I'm not mentioning the teacher because the NCF, which is the school curriculum framework, continued to have a sort of a frame within which the teacher was still being looked at as implementing agency and not as someone who would actually participate in curriculum as a deliberative act, but she was being given curriculum to actually implement or transact in the classroom. So there was a contradiction within the NCF, and therefore I would foreground this idea a little later when I'm trying to connect it with other aspects. But there was also, through the curriculum discourse, the whole idea of looking at culture, not only in terms of its meaningful integration with school knowledges, with school curriculum, but also in terms of interrogating the local narratives so that we are able to actually question some of the traditional practices that may be retrograde and that would need to be overcome in order to create a more progressive educational frame. Interestingly, this renewed interest in education actually also happened alongside a whole decade when we had some of the most progressive legislations that emerged as a result of social movements. And this is the Right to Information Act that came in 2004, the Right to Education Act, we took that long to actually institute it as a central legislation in 2009, and the Food Security Act, which has also been a recent achievement. Now, these have all happened as a result of social movements, of civil society becoming very active in bringing about this. And lastly, but most significantly, in 2012, there was a high-powered commission of the Supreme Court of India that gave a report on teacher education. I was one of the commissioners of this report, and it is one of the most radical ways of looking at teacher education and its relationship with society. However, there's a clear wedge that we have between policy and the curriculum discourse. The neoliberal assault actually on education has also been a result of the challenges of internationalizations, pressures from international communities, pressures of the kind that forced us to take certain choices which were not really in alignment with the curriculum discourse. Measures were actually antithetical to the curricular discourse, and the thrust, of course, we all are familiar with, is on learning outcomes, teacher performance, efficiency, accountability, standardized testing, and so on. The impact that this has on educational practice is obviously the whole thrust on skills and the learning outcomes, but more importantly, the marginalization of knowledge and the marginalization of the teacher. Now, in a context like ours, where we already had a vacuum, so to speak, or a very difficult space within our universities, our centers of higher education, where our knowledge was really contextualized because we still borrowed a lot from other countries. The legacy continued for a long time. But at a time like this, we are already using policy enforcements that are forcing us to marginalize knowledge, that knowledge itself is of little value and it is skill that matters. Now, in a sense, this mirrors the colonial experience, because even during that time, knowledges were marginalized of a different kind. And certainly the teacher is also pushed on to the margins, because the teacher becomes a stronger state agent, so to speak, in fulfilling the kind of policy vision that the state has for itself, quite different from what the curricular discourse was, which was actually accepted by state apex bodies, and yet that's why I'm showing the sort of wedge between the two. And this, of course, has been leading to widening of inequalities, because the very purposes of education had turned. Interestingly, even the idea of quality, I mean, there's been, quality has been the new silver bullet for some time, and people have been talking about quality education. But with this kind of a focus and thrust on skills and learning outcomes, quality became synonymous with learning outcomes. To my mind, therefore, quality education seemed to be being looked at as something which happens outside the space of education. It's about learning outcomes. And the policy shift therefore happened from classroom spaces to testing children, which is outside classroom spaces. And this has led to very critical spaces of intervention like the classroom, or the way we prepare our teachers out of the gaze of policy makers. And I consider this a major collusion between the way we define quality and the way we define poverty. Poverty itself actually is being defined by poverty researchers as well as education researchers as an external barrier, as something to be crossed. There's very little engagement by both educational researchers and poverty researchers to look at how poverty plays out in classrooms, how exactly processes of exclusion actually stare you in the face inside the classroom. So my argument is that basically with this kind of a reorientation of looking at quality as learning outcomes and looking at poverty as only an external barrier, there seems to be a collusion between the two in terms of policy making, and it's taking our gaze away from the critical space of intervention. And teachers continue to be implementing agencies. Alongside, there are non-state actors. So we have a very active corporate sector that actually assumes to be the community of expert knowledge in education. So the academic voice itself is getting marginalized, and there is this danger of undermining a central legislation which is not very old, just about 2009. But education is a deliberative democracy. Education is about creating a way of life which enables us to become more democratic as a larger social order, and curriculum as social dialogue. Now, In this context, I mean, this may be a very utopian way of looking at it and posing it in the context that I have just given you. But the question is, we need to sort of bring back some of the classic thinkers who have engaged with these questions, whether it's Dewey, who has been looking at the issue of democracy in education, and not just as a philosopher, but as someone who has actually tried out ideas in a school. And I think people are now sort of rediscovering some of those in order to engage with what we're facing currently. What is required, therefore, is a complete rethink of the cultures of learning and thinking. There is need to look at knowledge and curriculum in more contextualized ways. Now, this is in stark contrast to the early 1950s, 60s, when we were looking at questions of essential knowledges for their own sake. But I think it's very important for us to understand, not in a very postmodernist sense, and I think there's a danger if we go too much in that direction, but the question really is to look at knowledges in contextualized ways, where culture becomes a means of meaning making, and yet it becomes an epistemological object for interrogation, for questioning, for discussion. So that's the kind of challenge we're facing, where there is a context where cultural nationalism is showing its ugly face, but we are, as educators, quite aware that it's not culture and tradition that's going to help us to develop our curriculum, which will be contextualized. So really the question is, what does contextualization mean? In one sense, contextualization to some people may actually mean something that would be where you look at knowledge and culture as synonymous. And if we have a very strong textbook culture, kind of a society where schools rely a lot on textbooks, which is not very different in India. We haven't been able to get out of that frame. In that kind of a frame, culture is embedded in a textbook, and we look at culture as transmission of curriculum. But we are talking of, through the NCF 2005, curriculum that is not something that is inside the covers of textbooks, but a space inside the classroom. So we look at curriculum as something that moves into the realm of the quotidian of the everyday classroom, where actually it is constructed and co-constructed or deconstructed. And that is what I mean by contextualizing curriculum, using culture to make meaning, but also to question it as an object of inquiry. And here the role of the teacher becomes absolutely critical, because there is no way other than the teacher being a mediator in this process. And therefore the focus needs to be on bridging the gap between the teacher and the curriculum. To some extent, we have, through concepts of child-centered education, concepts of constructivism, although I personally think that child-centered concepts in India have had all kinds of local interpretations. They're not been really informed by theoretical debates that where they originated from. So where two strands may be coming from two different directions of the globe, there could be a constructivism that we look at which comes from the works of Jean Piaget, etc. And there's a constructivism which comes from progressive school movement. But the question is that in our context, we have had far too much engagement just on local interpretations of these and not really engaged enough with theory. The result being that even though there has been some attempt to bridge gaps between the child and the curriculum through these concepts, no matter they may not be very rigorous, but there's been absolutely no attempt to develop a bridge between the teacher and curriculum, because the curriculum still remains outside the consciousness of the teacher, as the teacher is meant to only implement it. Therefore, we need to institute processes which are emancipatory in terms of pedagogic processes, not just curricula and content, And in this, we need to reclaim the space for teachers for a socially responsive education. And this brings me to the idea of teacher agency, the idea which I think has been abandoned for quite some time, the idea that teachers and schools can actually make a difference, the idea that educational spaces can be spaces of contestation and can be spaces for transformation. I mean, the sociologists all over the world have been telling us that it's just about cultural reproduction that you can do sitting inside schools. Now, I don't know what business we have to be educators if we cannot create agency in the spaces where we work. And I think the idea of social transformation needs to be put on track in some other way so that we are able to exploit its full potential. Globally, we see that policy measures, across different countries have replaced the idea of teacher agency with very prescriptive measures. But there is now a recognition of agency as an important dimension. Some of the work that I have read is mentioned here. And BERA, of course, who has particularly noted that it's not the what and how the teachers work, but that we need to tell teachers how to do. The teachers need to develop their own professional judgment. I personally feel that we need to look at the idea of teacher agency even before they become teachers, in a sense. And the critical space of that should be the space of preparation of teachers. So let's theorize teacher agency for a bit at the moment. People have talked about the fact that it is an idea that really talks about resistance to authority. It's an idea that talks about proactive communities of practice. A lot of people have talked about this. Or that it's a socially constituted capacity to act in a proactive way, in a certain way. And of course, the fact that it's not something that belongs to the individual, resides inside an individual, but it is the way we shape our responses to situations that pose challenges to us. So scholars have distinguished between agency as discursively and socially constructed and agency as developing individual subjectivities. So it's not as if we can ignore the self and the idea of selfhood if we look at the issue of socially constituted sense of agency, because the self and the other actually interact very intimately. The layered dimensions that I like to pose in front of you today about teacher agency is that if we do believe that it is about reshaping, reconstituting identities, individual identities, and the positions that we have as teachers in society in order to reach the larger goal of social transformation and social justice, then the intellectual agency also needs to be with the teacher. The teacher cannot be told what to teach. The teacher cannot be told given a certain kind of curriculum, set of textbooks, and asked to follow those. This implies that the teacher will have to be in control of her own knowledge, encompassing subject matter, pedagogic knowledge, knowledge of learners, knowledge of the context of learners. So intellectual agency is not only subject knowledge, but it's also about understanding the relationship between knowledge and power, for example. The second aspect of teacher agency, to my mind, is that of political action. It's not enough to reason, to understand, to grasp the problem. The aspect of agency really is about active intervention, and which is political in nature. So agency implies that teachers are able to make these shifts, a major shift in the way they think about knowledge, in the way they think about children, in the way they think about education per se. And action forms the nucleus of agency. So when curriculum is perceived to be a deliberative act towards a socially just pedagogy and create social transformation, then teacher collectives become an important nucleus of political action. It's been a very recent development in South Africa where teacher unions have actually got together and they were able to stall the practice of national assessments that were happening over years. But of course now they are in negotiation in terms of how and what and when. But the question is that political action can happen when teachers are able to form collectives. At least in my context, in the country where I belong, I find that there is more or less a conspiracy to keep teachers alone, to let them struggle alone and not allow collectives to actually take place. So we desperately need ways of creating platforms where we can create collectives of teachers so that they can influence policy. Now, how do we cultivate agency? I would like to make a distinction here on some of the scholars' work who believe that agency is something about, professional judgment inside a classroom. How do I judge the kind of curriculum that I choose to transact, the manner in which I do? How do I look at the evaluation of children and so on? But I think agency is not possible to create and cultivate only in spaces where we operate as professionals. I think a critical space where we can actually develop and cultivate a sense of agency is the pre-service teacher education program. Especially important is this idea in the context of the market forces which are pushing us into accepting the idea of short-term 5-week courses, whether it is Teach for India coming straight from a global network of Teach for America and so on. And we are being sort of forced into making a choice between a long-term teacher education program and short-term programs because there is the belief that you only need to develop a certain repertoire of skills. Now let's locate the agency of teachers. There are 4 prerequisites that I think are critical as simultaneous processes, and any focus on one of them alone is not going to do the job. So access to schooling in terms of both physical and social access, an adequate teaching learning environment, an appropriate school curriculum. We've come this far as India is concerned. But the most critical aspect is the empowered and the inclusive teaching community where we are losing out. Because this critical link has been always cast aside by both policymakers and perhaps the educator community themselves. So the critical spaces for cultivating teacher agency, as I said, is a well-crafted pre-service program where we can look at teacher education, how it can enable a self-constitution, which is what we're talking about in terms of agency as a potent force that can provide us the opportunity to interrogate the roles that teachers have, their identities and their positions in society. I'd like to present before you an exemplar program that we have been now conducting, transacting for over 2 decades. It's the 22nd year that we are in. It's called the Bachelors of Elementary Education, which demonstrates teacher education that by design we can actually create learning spaces which challenge popular assumptions, popular beliefs, in a sense pose processes that help us to engage with processes of counter-socialization, so to speak. The principles that govern the structure of this 4-year program are the following: interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity in terms of inquiry, in terms of learning, an interplay which is dialogical between theory and practice, the deconstruction and reconstruction of school knowledge. Typically, teacher ed programs have not engaged with questions of school knowledge because it's been seen as a given and not part of the preparation of the teacher. An engagement with human relations, a journey of the self, and the practice of communication, and of course hands-on experience. The critical engagement using these principles is around the nature of knowledge itself, knowledge claims, nature of learner, learning, notions of selfhood, identity, subjectivity. In a sense, renegotiating identities. So the teachers in these 4 years develop to look at their own identities in terms of what they are, in terms of the possibilities of reconstituting and renegotiating those, and deconstructing discourses that they encounter in their day-to-day lives. And this is via critically designed components of the program. So I'm going to just share with you some snippets of some of the school teachers who've been prepared through this 4 years program. This is who now in fact is a teacher educator. She went through the 4-year program, did a master's in sociology, and has been back to teach now. And she says very clearly, articulates it very clearly, I started appreciating that there was a variety of childhoods. Now that's typical of India. So we have to get out of the textbook image of the childhood or an ideal childhood. So universals have to be completely challenged. And they can only be challenged if we move our teacher preparation programs from mere theoretical classroom discourses to a praxis-oriented discourse that takes us to real-life situations where we look at children. Each childhood shaped by factors like region, religion, occupation, caste, schooling. This kind of learning enabled me to cultivate a more informed understanding of the process of teaching my future students and my location in society. I could finally see myself as a change maker, a sense of agency that I can make a difference. The society education dialectic is expressed by another. She is now a teacher in a university. She actually teaches political science. She did the BLEd and then she did a master's in political science, and she is a higher education teacher, not teaching education, but doing education in a sense. A graduate reflects on how courses in the BLEd made me a more conscious and sensitive person to issues of education and politics. What counts as learning, what is taught and how it is taught are deeply political questions. Now, it's a known fact that education is a very contested space. It is a space for struggle. But somehow, the larger frames of education have always forced us as educators to accept the neutrality of education, because that is what serves the larger system. That is what serves the status quo of the system. But here we are looking at how a young person immediately identifies through the 4 years to understand that these are not anything but political questions. Much refinement, she says, comes from the various practicum projects, field visits, and the internship program. And of course, questions of rethinking knowledge and learning. This is a teacher educator speaking. Respecting teachers' opinions, allowing them to freely air their questions and disagreements. Rigorously enforcing the teacher's right to know. The basis of an argument. Asserting nothing on the basis of authority, which is what we do in education. Authority becomes almost the sort of nucleus of how we actually transact in our classrooms, but only on the basis of hard evidences, in support and facilitating a comparison of their own experiences with what is being discussed. So knowledge claims, knowledge propositions, and knowledge itself. What is knowledge? What is worth teaching? What is worth transacting? Which knowledges are we talking about? How it interacts and interplays with power in society. These become important, but they must be brought into the classroom discourse for engagement. For only when they become objects of inquiry can the young people feel free to manifest their deepest of conflicts and to engage with them in order to become far more democratic in the way they think. So it's about democratization and attitudes and beliefs can only happen through democratic processes where the pedagogic processes themselves allow those free expressions. Reconstructing disciplinary knowledge. Actually, the BLEd has a very interesting combination of general liberal arts and science courses along with professional courses. And school subjects are engaged with in terms of their epistemological underpinnings. And the engagement with epistemology actually is a precursor to pedagogy. Pedagogy is not about just method, and that's where we've gone horribly wrong in teacher education, because then method does not differ from a science teaching to a social science teaching or to a mathematics teaching, and most of the students get a glossed over idea of how the blackboard should be used, etc. Engagement with content becomes very critical, and within the BLEd that happens very closely. There's also interdisciplinary social inquiry. A very well-known historian, Romila Thapar, talks about how diversities become an important engagement for young people, and certainly those who are going to be educating other young people. So how diversities come into being? Why is there inequality? How attitudes supporting this inequality are constructed? How they become part of a system? How the local conditions and surroundings can be more purposefully studied, but if they are seen in the larger context of a nation. So in the early years, India was very, very apprehensive about including the local narratives in school curricula, because we had the Herculean task of keeping a country together, a country that was absolutely dauntingly diverse. Not that that has changed very much, but we are certainly in a maturer frame now, a deeper democracy, which helps us to look at local narratives without the dangers of that dividing us, but to actually look at it critically. So curriculum and pedagogy both are deliberative acts, and interdisciplinary engagement creates that platform, and knowledge is constructed as it is embedded in society. So integrating theory and experience and the dialectic between them, interrogating theory and experience and the dialectic, teacher practitioners who have actually gone through these 4 years, for example, we have a very major component of theatre, drama, creative drama. And they find that drama gave them the space to explore possibilities when none existed. So it's a non-threatening environment which brings in the most vexing questions of social issues, of society, including one's own prejudices, one's own biases, beliefs and assumptions, but not through a lecture classroom, through a non-threatening environment, whether it's theatre, music, craft, self-development. It leads young students to question their own assumptions, but in a way that does not disturb their basic self. And addressing these questions, which are very, very deeply personal in nature, questions of identity, caste, gender, and so on. The student who qualified from here again writes, human relations and education. I remember when we put in a course like this, we had lots of people asking us, why a course on human relations? Why a course, a practicum on self-development? But this is what she has to say, that these workshops demanded that I reflect on myself and my experiences with the help of theoretical frames. So theory provides a lens through which I look at myself and the other and society and questions of social issues. They first made me aware of various stereotypes and then conscious about how I had internalized them. So stereotypes, if they're talked about as something that exists in society without looking at the self and the other relationship, without a journey into one's own identity, actually become cold reason and rationality, which does not allow us to transcend the immediate, to transcend what is actually happening in life. So I'm very comfortable intellectualizing about these issues, and that's what education teaches us to do. But I will have to confront my own self if I want to bring about change, because the intellectualization process is not going to touch either me or anyone else. These workshops made a deep impact on my personality, helping me to evolve as a more secular, tolerant person. Above all, I learned to aspire as a teacher, to take pride in myself after overcoming the grip of my own socialization. It's not easy to talk about oneself, but if you go through a journey like this in a non-threatening way, which also enables you to reason alongside, it's possible for a person to become a whole person. Forging links between pedagogy and curriculum. This is another school teacher who has shared how the BLEd actually helped develop perspective, and she calls it perspectives with respect to various issues, and how she's able to appreciate the role of children and give importance to learning which is more real rather than rote learning. And the most important thing here is the challenge of forging links between the individual and the social. I think that's really a challenge that many of us face across the world. It's a tough one because the individual freedom and choice, which is a very significant aspect of human civilization that we cherish, how do we enable a frame within which I look at freedom of myself alongside the freedom of other people? I mean, that's a huge challenge of democracy. But I think when the individual and the social are engaged with together in tandem through different modes of knowing, not through reason alone, but through modes of knowing which help me to look at art, to look at craft, to look at music, to actually understand society through these different modes of knowing. I develop knowledges that come from these different modes of knowing, which are quite different from cold rationality. And this is where the BLEd is able to achieve a sort of a link that forges between, and this is something that comes from our tradition as well. If you look at the Indian tradition of looking at a national system of education post-independence, which was an effort tried during the latter years of the colonial period, whether it was Gandhi, whether it was Tagore, or Vivekananda, or Aurobindo. The idea was to actually look at education that helps us to forge the link between the individual and the social, that for Gandhi, getting freedom from colonial rule was as important as freeing oneself from the inner shackles that bound us. So this link between the inner reflection and the social was a very significant aspect of our tradition. Our current system of education does not quite bring this link very clearly. We are still very caught in a frame where we look at education as something from without. But we need to bring in the aspect of education as something from within as much. And that is the challenge that is before us, which we try and address through this program. And of course, the idea of how we can make learning spaces more democratic, the creation of these spaces through different components of the program. There are several more testimonies which I need not spend too much time on. You can look at it for a few seconds and I can change the slide. So the struggle continues, and this is a teacher educator who had done the BLed, then did the Masters in Sociology, is now teaching in my institute, is my colleague. And she says she comes from a Dalit background, which is the lower caste, which is what Ambedkar was fighting for against. He's, you know, globally known as the architect of India's constitution, but he was a deep philosopher. He had worked with John Dewey. He was a thinker. He had done enough deep philosophical thinking on questions of caste. His essay on the annihilation of caste is very famous, but unfortunately we don't draw enough on our own thinkers to bring to education. She says the Malays conflict was an essential stage of understanding the world before we could undergo a crucial shift in perspective and the ways in which our minds and lives are shaped. It is a conflict which provided me an impulse towards transformation and struggle waged at intellectual levels. Even today, I am fighting against many battles as a woman and as a Dalit. So I guess the issue is that education and preparation of teachers in particular will have to be spaces where conflict is brought to the surface, where conflicts are actually engaged with. And it's these conflicts and the engagement with it which help us to get impetus to do something about them. So it's about weaving the conceptual and not undermining theory at all, which is what is happening globally. In fact, theory has become less and less important in many teacher education programs, and many of us are fighting against that move. I think it's very important to use theory as a lens to understand, but we need to interweave it with the experiential. And I do not think that we can, the balance is so important because it's very easy to swing from one end of theoretical engagement to complete ad hocism in terms of experiential. And I think that's the balance that's required. So the success of this program is really about integrating these and looking at the cultural self also as an object of inquiry. So agency is affected through a socially constituted self. The focus on personhood and subjectivity helps developing teachers to reshape and renegotiate their identities. And in that process, they don't learn to mouth the aims of education of John Dewey or constructivism of Piaget or the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi's Nai Taaleem, but they learn to articulate aims of education that are most immediately relevant in their context, in the context of society and the children that they engage with. These provide them with conceptual tools that are emancipatory, allowing them to break the shackles of their own socialization by engaging with structures that affect agency. Because we can't talk of agency without looking at the challenges of structures. I mean, this is something the sociologists have been talking about for a long time. But my plea is, shall we not end the structure agency debate by abandoning the idea of agency? Shall we sort of configure this? And that's why I call the title of my talk, Redefining the Contours of Change. Should we not try to relook at all of this? Should we not try to engage with the question of creating the possibility of change within spaces of education and collectives of educators that can challenge the structures which seem to, sort of weigh so heavy on us in our systems of schooling. So could we say that teacher agency is probably a living philosophy? In this sense, agency is not just a socio-psychological construct, but a living philosophy. Intellectual agency brings conviction to reconstructed perspectives about society, learning, knowledge, children, and the impetus to take political action. So individual and collective action is made possible, leading to what could be called political agency, when ways of thinking become ways of acting in the world. Thank you very much.
Poonam, Thank you very much. You brought into the room some of the inherent tension points that I think many of us feel in education. I particularly liked where you ended up with both structure and agency, and the importance of finding the space in which agency can really do its necessary work. I like the reminder from an English perspective of the importance of teacher education itself as being a key arena. If we do not find the space to prepare young teachers well, it is that much more difficult to create an education system that will work for all. We've got some time for questions. If people in the room would like to raise some, we have some roving microphones that are out the front. I'm going to suggest that we take maybe 2 or 3. I can see one up at the back, one down here. Anybody else? All right, we'll start. Oh, there's 2 right at the back. All right, so we're going to, while somebody climbs up, if somebody can get to Brian, wave your hand. Okay, we'll start off with Brian, then we're going to go to Helen, whom I've recognised, who's 3 down, and then we're going to go right up at the back, the woman with the glasses, whose name I don't know. All right, so we're going to start with Brian Street, then we're going to go Helen, then we're going to go right up the back. Okay?
Sorry, I think I took too long.
Hello? Is it work? Oh yes, it is. Okay, well thank you ever so much. I thought that was wonderful, and I'll say in a moment I think something like this could be applied to the English government, not just in India, but just to underline the key issues. I like the way you brought together curriculum and pedagogy, they're not separate. Epistemology, and as an anthropologist I would bring in ethnographic perspective and reflexivity, and also your emphasis on identity and agency. Wonderful. So my question, I've worked with some organisations in India, mainly adults in Niranta, is what actually happens when you sit around the table with government. You can sit around here and I suspect most of us will nod and agree and think this is wonderful. How do we cope, and I've had this problem in England as well, with government agents who take a very different view? How do you deal with that?
Okay, that's one question resting on the table, how to deal with governments. If we can pass along to the middle of the row there, to Helen. You can just shout if you prefer, Helen.
Can you hear? Yeah, okay. I'm interested in the style of this kind of democracy for teacher education. So if we look at the work of Clive Harbour, who's done work on a democratisation of teacher education in Africa, that's a style that is set in and for Africa. Now in India you have very deep roots of a spiritual kind, and you mentioned Tagore, Gandhi, and in particular Vivekananda. And I'm wondering what role those kinds of voices, Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Vivekananda, what voices they have that can offer a very different style that's particularly Indian, where your teachers, as Indian teachers, can be agents of Indian education.
Okay, so something to do with the specifics of place. I think that ties in very well with what you were talking about earlier about the colonial legacy. Last one.
Hi, my name is Sally. Thank you very much indeed for your talk. I found it really interesting. My question is about coverage, really, geographical. So your course sounds fascinating, and I just wondered how widespread that is. You know, is it just in Delhi in the north, or does it spread further down to the south, or also to the north-east? I've done some work in Assam and Mizoram, and I just wondered, that's a geographically, and also in terms of different types of schooling. You know, is it just for fee-paying schools, or do your teachers go into sort of governmental schools, Christian foundation schools, and so on? Thank you.
Okay, so you're ready to go.
How do you work with governments? I think we'd need, several cups of coffee to engage with that question. It's really tough. And interestingly, we've had some, I mean, they're almost like case studies. For example, you worked with Nirantar, right? Nirantar is one of the most significant organizations that has brought in gender and education sort of upfront. And they have contributed quite deeply to the curriculum discourse, which is what is in the NCF document. There have been cases of non-governmental organizations that have actually worked with government. But this was possible in a period when the sort of market hadn't quite penetrated, you see. And once this whole sort of structure has changed in terms of opening up the markets, in terms of economic liberalization, it's become even tougher. At this point in time, I am very saddened to say, but the academic voice, even in the higher education space, has actually been marginalized. But the Justice Verma Commission that I mentioned, which is on teacher education, that was a Supreme Court appointed commission. And that's really something that a country feels the need, where the judiciary steps in terms of an academic question. Of course, it came due to an administrative problem of too many teacher ed private institutions coming up, which were teaching shops basically. But as part of that commission, I was a commissioner in that, we found that the possibility of policy making or influencing policy of the government is actually, it happens when one goes in a low-key sense. You don't sort of assert yourself as an academic, you sort of quietly go into some of these committees and you're able to influence. Because we do have a lot of possibility of engagement within policy circles. I find that space now shrinking quite a bit. So, yes, I mean. The second question with regard to Indian teachers and Indian education, I would, really hesitate using the term Indian, because that's precisely what we are fighting against. There is a tendency to homogenize identities in India. There is no such thing as Indian. I mean, geographically, yes, but the point is that there isn't an Indian way of looking at something. Indian psychology, which is being touted here and there, Indian philosophy, every single philosopher who has actually created the space for a new kind of education, whether it's Krishnamurti, whether it's Vivekanand, whether it was Shantiniketan of Tagore and several others, each one has a very unique philosophy, and that's the interesting thing. But the sad thing is that we haven't been able to influence our mainstream education system with these philosophies. These philosophies are vibrant. They're in different parts of the country, and thank God they're there. But the point is, we still need to find ways of bringing them into the mainstream and an interface which will help us to challenge. We've been able to do some of this through the teacher ed program, and many of our teacher graduates who come out of this program are able to look at philosophies like this and bring it into their spaces of education. The last question was with regard to,
It's a geographic, yeah. Is it the same?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the BLH certainly is more sort of contained, because we run it in the University of Delhi undergraduate colleges. It's not a program of a university department. It was very consciously designed to be an undergraduate model, because that's where, there's far more sort of corporate life of the college, and it enables an interdisciplinarity. We haven't been able to expand the program too much outside. There are few universities here and there, but now with the recommendations of the Justice Verma Commission, this model has found much more visibility, and we've been able to influence the state models of teacher ed, which are the 2-year DIET programs that run across. In the Northeast, we've just done one for them in Meghalaya, involving the whole teacher ed community there. So in that sense, we're trying to do that. It's going to take a while, but there is a space now, because the norms also have been revised to include many of these ideas into a teacher ed program. So now in this year, we're actually now doing a 2-year B.Ed and a 2-year M.Ed, Earlier, the B.Ed was always 1 year. So we've been able to raise that and include many of these aspects. I'm teaching gender as a course in the B.Ed program for the first time. But in the BLEd, we had a course like this in 1994. So it took us 20 years to convince the community that this is an important engagement. And I remember when Madeleine Arnott had come over to India, this is about 7 years ago, she said, you've been able to include a core course on gender, which we haven't been able to do in the UK. And Erica Berman also, I remember, talking about how her work on childhood has actually not really found space within teacher preparation programs. So there is a politics of knowledge production and knowledge absorption and assimilation within teacher preparation programs as well.
That's a very good note on which to end, actually. Again, we're back with the tension points, but I think what's really heartening from your description is the use that you've been able to make of the space you're operating in. I'm going to ask us to clap. We're going to thank Poonam very much. Then we're going off to the reception back in the main sports hall. Okay, drinks in the sports hall.
I'm so glad.